Victor Hayes walked into the charity gala wearing a suit that had seen better years and shoes that had been polished too many times to hide their age. Nobody in that ballroom knew his name. Nobody cared to ask. To the women in designer gowns and the men in tailored tuxedos, he looked like exactly what they assumed he was. A single father who had wandered in on a borrowed invitation, someone who did not belong among marble floors and crystal chandeliers. When the city's most talked about millionaire, Vanessa Carter, spotted him standing near the roped-off section reserved for her closest guests, she did not lower her voice. She laughed, right in front of her own bodyguard, loud enough for 3 tables to hear. "Do people like you really believe you belong in a place like this?" she asked. And the room laughed with her, because laughing with Vanessa Carter was simply what people did. But less than 10 minutes later, when her 6'5" bodyguard marched toward Victor with the clear intention of throwing him out onto the street, nobody could have predicted what happened next. The quiet man in the worn suit moved like something the room had never seen, and in less than 3 seconds, the bodyguard was on the floor. And Vanessa Carter, for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something close to fear. Victor Hayes was 38 years old, and there was very little about his daily life that suggested he had once been anything other than ordinary. He fixed industrial machinery for a living, the kind of high-precision equipment that factories paid enormous sums to keep running, and he did the work with a quiet competence that made him valuable, without ever making him visible. Years earlier, before the divorce, before the silence he had built around himself like a second skin, he had served in an elite branch of the Special Forces, the kind of unit whose missions were never discussed at dinner parties because they were rarely discussed at all. He did not talk about that part of his life, not to coworkers, not to the few friends who had stuck around after his marriage ended, and certainly not to strangers at events he had only agreed to attend as a favor. His ex-wife had taken their daughter to live 3 states away, and Victor had rebuilt his existence around 2 things only: providing for his child from a distance, and staying as far from cameras, headlines, and crowded rooms as a man could manage in a city like Boston. His apartment told the story of a man who had deliberately chosen simplicity over comfort. 2 bedrooms in a modest building near the edge of town. One of them kept ready for the weekends his daughter occasionally visited, the walls decorated with nothing more than a few photographs and a single folded flag in a glass case. He never opened the curtains wide enough for visitors to notice. He drove a truck that was 11 years old and ran perfectly, because Victor was the kind of man who fixed things rather than replaced them, a philosophy that extended well beyond machinery into the way he approached every relationship and every disappointment life had handed him. He had learned somewhere in those years of service no one was allowed to ask him about that the loudest people in a room were rarely the most dangerous, and the most dangerous people in a room were almost never the ones trying to prove it. That lesson had shaped him into someone who moved through the world quietly, who answered questions with the fewest words necessary, and who had absolutely no interest in convincing strangers of his own worth, because he had long ago stopped needing their approval to know exactly who he was. The gala that autumn evening was held in one of the most expensive hotels downtown, the kind of place where the lobby alone cost more to decorate than most people earned in 5 years. Victor had been invited by an old friend from his mechanic days, a man who had married into money and felt guilty enough about it to insist Victor come along, if only for one night. Victor almost said no. He always said no to things like this. But his friend pushed, and Victor, who rarely had reason to leave his small apartment on weekends, eventually agreed, mostly because he was tired of eating dinner alone in front of a silent television. He wore the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray piece bought years earlier for a funeral, and he made no effort to dress it up because impressing strangers had never been something he valued. From the moment he stepped through the hotel's revolving doors, he felt the eyes on him, the quick up and down glances, the way conversations paused just slightly when he passed. He ignored it the way he ignored most things that did not threaten him directly. He found a quiet corner near the edge of the ballroom, took a glass of water instead of champagne, and waited for an appropriate moment to slip away early. Then the doors opened again, and the temperature of the room seemed to shift. Vanessa Carter walked in wearing a deep emerald gown that had clearly been chosen to be noticed, her heels clicking against marble with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted she deserved every eye in the building. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Waiters adjusted their posture. Even the string quartet in the corner seemed to play a touch more carefully. She was 35 years old and had built an empire in commercial real estate from nothing but ambition and an almost frightening instinct for negotiation, the kind of self-made success story that made magazine covers want to call her inspiring. She had grown so accustomed to admiration that she no longer noticed when she expected it. The way most people stop noticing the sound of their own breathing. As she scanned the room with the practiced eye of someone calculating which conversations were worth her time, her gaze landed on Victor, standing quietly near the section reserved for her most important guests, and something about his stillness, his refusal to perform for the room the way everyone else was performing, irritated her in a way she could not immediately name. Vanessa had not clawed her way to the top of her industry by being soft, and she had certainly not gotten there by being kind to people who did not matter to her bottom line. She had started with nothing but a small inheritance and a willingness to work nights and weekends while her competitors slept, buying her first rundown property at 24 years old, and flipping it for a profit that most people would have considered a miracle. But that Vanessa considered simply the beginning. She judged rooms the way she judged property values, instantly and without sentiment, sorting people into categories of useful and irrelevant before they had even finished introducing themselves. She was undeniably intelligent, sharp enough to spot a bad deal 3 steps before her competitors saw it coming. But that same sharpness had calcified over the years into something colder, a habit of measuring human worth by the cut of a suit or the weight of a watch. Somewhere along the way, in the long climb from a single rundown property to an empire spanning dozens of buildings across 3 states, she had stopped distinguishing between the discipline that built her fortune and the cruelty that sometimes rode alongside it, telling herself that toughness and unkindness were simply 2 names for the same necessary quality. When she saw Victor standing near her circle in clothes that did not match the price tag of the room, her first assumption was not curiosity but contempt, the quiet certainty that he must be some opportunist who had talked his way past the door in hopes of meeting someone wealthy enough to fund whatever scheme he was running. She set down her glass, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked toward him with the same unhurried confidence she used when walking into a boardroom she already knew she would win. "Did you take a wrong turn somewhere?" she asked. Loud enough that the small cluster of guests nearby turned to listen, their smiles already forming in anticipation of whatever cutting remark was coming next. "Or, are you still looking for someone to cover the cost of your dinner?" The words landed exactly the way she intended, sharp and public, and the laughter that followed came easily from people who had learned long ago that laughing along with Vanessa Carter was safer than questioning her. Victor did not flinch. He looked at her the way a man looks at weather. He has already decided not to let ruin his day, calm, unbothered, almost disinterested in the performance unfolding in front of him. That stillness, more than any insult he could have thrown back, seemed to bother Vanessa more than she expected, though she would not have admitted it to herself in that moment. She turned slightly toward her bodyguard, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who stood a few feet behind her like a shadow-given muscle, and a tailored black suit, and with a small flick of her eyes, she gave him an instruction that needed no words. "Watch him." Victor tried to do what he always did in rooms like this, which was simply disappear into the background until it was socially acceptable to leave. He had no interest in confrontation, no desire to prove anything to a woman who had already decided who he was before he opened his mouth. He drifted toward the edge of the room near the windows, hoping the distance would be enough to end whatever had just started. But Vanessa was not the kind of person who let a moment like that go unfinished. She found him again 20 minutes later near the dessert table, and this time she brought an audience with her, a small group of fellow real estate developers, who seemed eager to watch their host entertain herself at someone else's expense. "So tell me," she said, tilting her head with mock curiosity, "what exactly do people in your line of work make in a year?" The question was not really a question. It was a performance, designed to humiliate, and everyone around them understood that immediately. A woman beside Vanessa, draped in jewelry that caught the chandelier light every time she moved, added her own remark about how refreshing it was to see someone humble enough to wear the same suit twice in one season, and the small group erupted into the kind of laughter that feeds on itself. growing louder simply because everyone wanted to seem like they understood the joke. Victor stood through it the way he stood through most things, with his weight settled evenly and his expression unreadable. The same composure he had once used waiting out ambushes in places far more dangerous than a hotel ballroom. None of these people, he thought, had any idea how small their cruelty actually was, compared to things he had survived, and that thought alone kept him from feeling even a flicker of the embarrassment they were so desperately trying to produce in him. Victor set down his glass slowly, met her eyes without aggression, and answered with 5 words that should have ended the conversation. Enough to live on. The simplicity of it, the complete absence of shame or apology, seemed to throw Vanessa off balance for half a second before she recovered and laughed louder than the joke deserved. And her audience laughed with her, the kind of laughter that exists only to please the person laughing loudest. One of the developers, a heavyset man with a watch that cost more than most cars, leaned in and asked Victor if he had come hoping to find investors for some small business idea, and the group chuckled again, enjoying the cruelty far more than they were enjoying the party itself. Victor said nothing. He had learned long ago that explaining yourself to people who had already made up their minds was a waste of breath. A lesson the military teaches faster than almost anything else in life. But Vanessa read his silence as weakness rather than restraint. And that misreading was about to cost someone a great deal more than embarrassment. Her irritation hardened into something closer to determination. The same look she wore in negotiations when someone refused to budge on a price she had already decided to win. She caught Marcus's eye again, and this time the instruction was not subtle at all. "Get him out of here," she said, just loud enough for the small crowd to hear, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone asking a waiter to clear a table. Marcus straightened immediately, the kind of man whose entire identity revolved around being useful to powerful people. And he began moving through the crowd toward Victor with the deliberate, unhurried gait of someone who had removed difficult guests from events many times before and never once needed more than a firm hand and a raised voice to get the job done. Marcus stopped directly in front of Victor, close enough that the height difference between them became impossible to ignore, and told him flatly that it was time to leave the premises. Victor's response was calm and entirely reasonable. He held up the small printed invitation his friend had given him weeks earlier, explaining quietly that he had been invited like everyone else in the room and had every right to stay until the event concluded. To a reasonable person, that would have been the end of it, but Marcus had spent years building his reputation on never backing down once Vanessa Carter had given an order, and backing down now, in front of dozens of witnesses, was not something his pride could absorb. He repeated himself, louder this time. And when Victor calmly repeated that he intended to stay, Marcus made the single worst decision of his professional career. He reached out and grabbed Victor by the shoulder, intending to physically escort him toward the exit, whether Victor agreed to walk there or not. What happened next took less time than it takes to finish a sentence. The moment Marcus's hand closed around Victor's shoulder, something in Victor shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but completely, the way a switch flips from one state to another without any wasted motion in between. His left hand came up and caught Marcus's wrist at an angle that turned the larger man's own grip into a liability, twisting just enough to redirect Marcus's considerable weight off its center, and before the bodyguard's brain could process what was happening to his own balance, his feet were no longer beneath him. Victor's movement was economical and almost gentle in its efficiency, the kind of technique built not to punish but simply to end a threat as quickly as possible, and within 3 seconds, Marcus, a man who outweighed Victor by at least 60 pounds and had never lost a physical confrontation in his professional life, was flat on the marble floor, with Victor's knee resting lightly across his shoulder, not crushing him, just controlling him, the way someone might pin down a door that kept swinging open in the wind. The room went completely silent. Glasses froze halfway to lips. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note, the violinist's bow suspended in the air, as though even the music understood that something had just changed in that ballroom. Marcus was not seriously hurt. His pride had absorbed most of the damage, but he was undeniably, humiliatingly helpless, pinned by a man everyone in that room had laughed at less than 15 minutes earlier. Phones came out instinctively, though most people were too stunned to actually press record, and a low murmur began spreading through the crowd. The unmistakable sound of 200 people simultaneously realizing they had badly misjudged something. Vanessa Carter stood frozen near the dessert table, her champagne glass tilted forward just enough that a few drops spilled onto the floor without her noticing. And for the first time that evening, she looked at Victor Hayes with an expression that had nothing to do with contempt. For one long, suspended moment, nothing in the ballroom moved at all, as though the entire room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. The heavyset developer who had mocked Victor earlier took an instinctive step backward, suddenly very interested in something on the other side of the room. The woman with the loud jewelry pressed a hand against her chest, her earlier laughter now feeling, even to her, like something shameful she wished she could take back. Victor stood over Marcus without triumph in his posture, his breathing barely elevated, looking less like a man who had just won a fight, and more like someone who had simply finished a task that needed finishing, the same flat calm he might have shown after tightening a stubborn bolt. It was that calm, more than the speed or the strength behind it, that unsettled everyone watching, because it told them this was not the first time he had done something like this. Not by a long distance. Hotel security arrived within minutes, moving through the crowd with the practiced urgency of people trained to handle exactly this kind of situation, though none of them had ever actually encountered anything like it before. Victor released his hold on Marcus the instant the situation no longer required restraint, stepping back calmly with his hands visible, the posture of someone who had done what was necessary and nothing more. He did not gloat. He did not look around the room to gauge reactions. He simply waited, the same quiet patience he had shown the entire evening, while a flustered event coordinator tried to determine what exactly had just happened and whether the police needed to be called. Several guests who had witnessed the entire exchange began talking over one another, some insisting Marcus had grabbed Victor first, others whispering that the man in the cheap suit had moved like a professional, the kind of phrase that immediately made several people in the crowd go quiet and start thinking harder about who Victor Hayes might actually be. One man near the back of the crowd, an older businessman who had spent 2 decades supplying logistics contracts to government agencies, stared at Victor with a flicker of recognition tightening across his face. He leaned toward his wife and murmured something about having seen a face like that in a security briefing years earlier. Something about classified personnel files he was never supposed to discuss outside of cleared rooms. The whispers spread faster than anyone could control. Who is that man? Where did he serve? How does someone move like that without even seeming to try? Vanessa overheard fragments of these questions as she stood there, still processing the fact that the man she had publicly mocked 20 minutes earlier had just dismantled her bodyguard with what looked like effortless precision, and a small, uncomfortable seed of curiosity began forming where her contempt had been sitting only moments before. She did what people with her kind of money and influence always do when curiosity turns into discomfort. She made a call before the event had even fully wound down, instructing a private investigator she occasionally used for background checks on business partners to pull together everything available on a man named Victor Hayes. She expected the report to take a day, maybe 2, filled with the unremarkable details of an unremarkable life. A divorce record, a modest income, perhaps an old arrest that would confirm her original assumptions and let her dismiss the entire embarrassing evening as a fluke. Instead, what came back unsettled her more than the takedown itself had. Long stretches of his military record were sealed, classified under designations the investigator admitted he had never been cleared to access in over 15 years of doing this kind of work. There were gaps in employment history that made no logical sense, periods of time when Victor Hayes appeared to not exist anywhere in any traceable system at all. The investigator called Vanessa personally to explain that whatever Victor Hayes had done during those missing years, it was the kind of work that left almost no paper trail behind, the kind reserved for people whose names were not meant to be remembered by anyone outside a very small, very secure circle. Vanessa sat alone in her penthouse that night. The city lights spread out beneath her window like scattered confetti, and felt an emotion she rarely allowed herself, something uncomfortably close to unease. She had spent her entire adult life learning to read people quickly, sorting them by wealth, by posture, by the brand names stitched into their clothing. And she had never once been wrong in a way that mattered. But she had looked directly at a man capable of disarming a trained bodyguard in 3 seconds, and had seen nothing but a struggling single father who did not belong in her world. The realization that her instincts, the very instincts she had built her empire on, had failed her so completely left her sleepless until well past 3 in the morning. Meanwhile, Victor went home that night the same way he went home every night, picking up a few groceries on the way, calling his daughter to say goodnight before her bedtime in another state, and falling asleep without giving the gala a second thought. He had no idea that across the city, one of the wealthiest women in Boston was lying awake trying to piece together who he really was. He had no interest in being known, no desire to be discussed in hushed tones at dinner parties. He would never attend again, and certainly no plan to ever cross paths with Vanessa Carter a second time. The following morning, he went to work at the small mechanical shop he had built a quiet reputation around, fixing a hydraulic system for a client who had been coming to him for 3 years and trusted no one else with equipment that expensive. He did not check the news. He did not know that a grainy 10-second video of the incident had already begun circulating among the city's wealthier social circles, passed from phone to phone with captions speculating wildly about who he might be. Vanessa's investigator eventually admitted defeat after several more days of digging, telling her plainly that whatever resources had been used to scrub Victor Hayes's deeper history were beyond anything available to a private firm, the kind of erasure typically reserved for people whose past work still mattered to national interests years later. Rather than satisfying her curiosity, the dead end only deepened it. She found herself replaying the moment in the ballroom over and over, the calm in his eyes as Marcus reached for him, the complete absence of fear or hesitation in a man who, by every outward appearance, had nothing and no one backing him up in that room. She began asking around quietly, careful not to reveal how much the incident had rattled her, and learned through a mutual acquaintance the name of the small mechanical shop where Victor reportedly worked. Against every instinct that told her this was beneath her, she decided she needed to see it for herself. The shop was smaller than she expected, tucked between a hardware store and an empty storefront on a street that did not match any version of Boston she typically frequented, the kind of neighborhood her firm usually drove past on the way to better investments. She almost turned around twice before parking her car, telling herself this was beneath someone of her standing, that walking into a mechanic shop to satisfy idle curiosity about a man who had embarrassed her bodyguard was not behavior befitting a woman with her reputation. But she went inside anyway. And what she found surprised her more than she expected. The waiting area, modest as it was, held 2 men in expensive coats, sitting patiently with the kind of quiet deference she only ever saw directed at people with real authority. Not the loud, performative respect money usually demanded, but something quieter and far more genuine. She watched from a distance as Victor finished a conversation with a client, a man who, judging by the car keys in his hand, clearly owned something worth more than most houses, and the respect in that man's voice when he thanked Victor was unmistakable, the tone reserved for someone whose judgment you trusted completely and without question. Vanessa realized, standing there in her tailored coat feeling oddly out of place for the first time in years, that whatever reputation Victor had built in this small, unremarkable shop was built entirely on substance, with none of the performance she had spent her career perfecting. She noticed a faded photograph taped near the register, a younger Victor in uniform standing beside several other soldiers, none of them smiling for the camera the way people usually do, all of them wearing the same distant, watchful expression she had seen on Victor's face the night of the gala. She noticed, too, a child's drawing pinned beside it, crayon stick figures labeled Daddy and Me in uneven handwriting, and something about the contrast between that hardened photograph and that small, careless piece of love struck her harder than she expected. When Victor finally noticed her standing near the door, his expression did not shift into surprise or discomfort. He simply looked at her the way he had looked at her in the ballroom, calm, unreadable, entirely unbothered by her presence or her power. "Who are you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she had decided to ask it, stripped of the usual confidence that colored everything she said in public. Victor wiped his hands on a cloth slowly, taking his time before answering. The way a man does when he has nothing left to prove to anyone. Someone who doesn't need to explain himself to you, he said, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for negotiation. The one skill she had always relied on to get what she wanted. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vanessa Carter stood in a room and felt distinctly, uncomfortably smaller than the person in front of her, and the strangest part was that he had not raised his voice or made any effort to put her in her place. He had simply existed, unmoved by her wealth, unimpressed by her name, and that alone had done more to unsettle her than anything he could have said. She left the shop that day without the answers she had come for, but with a question that followed her home and refused to let her sleep peacefully for the second time that week. A few days later, through the same mutual acquaintance who had pointed her toward the shop, she learned a piece of the story that finally began connecting the silence with the substance. An old friend of Victor's, a man who had served alongside him years earlier and now worked in private security consulting, mentioned almost in passing that Victor had once commanded operations most people would never read about in any newspaper, missions where lives were saved precisely because no one ever knew his name. He mentioned, carefully and without much detail, that several private security firms had once offered Victor contracts worth 7 figures annually. The kind of money that would have changed his life completely, and Victor had turned every single one of them down without hesitation. Why? Vanessa asked, unable to hide how badly she needed to understand a decision that made no sense to someone who had built her entire identity around accumulating more. The friend shrugged, explaining that Victor had seen enough of what that kind of money did to people, how it slowly replaced their reasons for living with reasons for protecting what they had, and he had decided somewhere along the way that he wanted a life measured by something other than a balance sheet. He wanted to raise his daughter on weekends without bodyguards trailing behind them, wanted to fix machines with his hands and go home tired in a way that felt earned rather than performed. Wanted, more than anything, to be left alone by a world that had already taken enough from him. Vanessa sat with that information for a long time after the conversation ended, turning it over the way she turned over a property she could not figure out how to value. Except this time the thing she could not figure out how to value was herself. She thought back to every room she had walked into over the past decade. Every person she had measured by their watch or their shoes or their job title before they had said a single word to her. And she began to understand, slowly and painfully, that her success had cost her something she had never bothered to notice was missing. Money had taught her to read rooms instantly, but it had also taught her to stop actually looking at the people in them. Success had sharpened her instincts for opportunity, while dulling something far more important, the basic human instinct to wonder who someone really was before deciding who they must be. The realization arrived with the force of something physical, a tightening in her chest that no negotiation, no acquisition, no record-breaking deal had ever produced in her before. And she understood, finally, that she needed to face Victor Hayes one more time, not as a millionaire seeking answers, but simply as a person who owed someone an apology. She thought, too, about her own father. A man who had worked 20 years in a warehouse before his back gave out. A man she had quietly stopped inviting to certain events once her career took off, telling herself it was simply easier that way, that he would not feel comfortable among people who spoke a different language of money and influence. She had never once considered, until this moment, that the discomfort she had been protecting him from was really just her own embarrassment, dressed up as consideration, and the thought sat in her stomach like something swallowed too quickly. If she had judged her own father by the same standards she had used to judge Victor in that ballroom, what did that say about every assumption she had built her entire adult identity on? The question followed her through sleepless nights more relentlessly than any business problem ever had. She found him again on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Not at a gala, not at his shop, but at a small park near his apartment, where he sometimes sat alone with a cup of coffee before his weekend video calls with his daughter. She approached slowly this time. None of the confidence from that first night anywhere in her posture, and sat down on the bench beside him without asking permission, The kind of gesture that would have felt presumptuous from anyone else but felt necessary coming from her. "I'm sorry," she said simply, the words feeling foreign in her mouth, unpracticed in a way nothing in her professional life ever was. "I judged you the moment I saw you, and I was wrong, and I think some part of me knew I was being cruel even while I was doing it, and I just didn't care enough to stop myself." Victor listened without interrupting, the same patience he had carried through every conversation since the night they met, and when she finished, he turned to look at her directly for the first time since she had sat down. "I'm not angry at you," he said quietly. And the simplicity of the statement somehow carried more weight than anger ever could have. "But you should learn to respect people before you decide what they're worth, not after they prove it to you in a way you can't ignore." The words landed exactly where they needed to, neither cruel nor comforting, just honest in a way that forced Vanessa to sit with the full weight of what she had become over the years, without anyone close enough to tell her the truth. Tears came before she expected them, the first time she had cried in front of another person in longer than she could remember, and she did not try to stop them or explain them away with some clever deflection the way she handled every other moment of vulnerability in her life. She simply sat there on that bench, crying quietly while a man she had publicly humiliated less than 2 weeks earlier offered her nothing but patience and an honesty she had not earned but desperately needed. Something shifted in her that afternoon, something that had nothing to do with business strategy or reputation management, the slow and uncomfortable beginning of actually seeing the world differently than she had seen it for the better part of 2 decades. She left the park that day without any of the answers she had originally come looking for, but with something far more valuable, a starting point for becoming a different kind of person than the one who had walked into that ballroom weeks earlier. The months that followed brought changes to Vanessa's life that none of her colleagues quite knew how to explain, though most of them noticed something had shifted without being able to name exactly what. She began showing up at community fundraisers that offered her nothing in terms of networking value, sitting quietly in rooms full of people who could do nothing for her career, listening to stories instead of calculating opportunities. She started a scholarship fund for children of military families, quietly, without press releases or photo opportunities, because for once in her life she was not interested in being seen doing something good, only in actually doing it. Colleagues who had known her for years began commenting that she asked different questions in meetings now, no longer just about numbers and projections, but occasionally, unexpectedly, about the people behind those numbers, about what they needed and what they had been through to get where they were standing. She also began calling her father every Sunday, something she had not done with any real consistency in nearly 5 years, and the first time he answered the phone sounding surprised to hear from her, she had to sit in her car outside her own office for several minutes before she trusted her voice enough to speak without it cracking. She invited him to dinner, a real one, not a quick obligatory lunch, squeezed between meetings, and she found herself listening to his stories about the warehouse with an attention she had never given them before, recognizing in his calloused hands and quiet pride something that reminded her, more than she expected, of Victor. Her assistant noticed she had stopped asking for the table near the window, reserved for important clients, and started simply asking for whatever table was available, a small detail that meant nothing to anyone except the version of herself who had spent a decade believing where you sat said everything about who you were. Victor's life, by contrast, changed very little, which was exactly how he preferred it. He continued running his small shop, continued his weekend calls with his daughter, continued declining the rare offers that came his way to discuss what had happened that night at the gala, because none of it mattered to him nearly as much as it seemed to matter to everyone else. He had no interest in being a story people told at dinner parties, no desire to capitalize on a moment that had only ever been about defending himself, not about proving anything to a room full of strangers who had already decided he was worthless before he opened his mouth. The video of the incident eventually faded from circulation the way most things online eventually do, replaced by newer scandals and fresher gossip. And Victor was grateful for the fading, grateful to return to the quiet anonymity he had built his entire post-military life around protecting. His daughter visited for 2 full weeks that summer, and Victor spent every spare hour teaching her to change a tire and rebuild a small engine. The same patient, Wordless instruction his own father had once given him in a garage that smelled of motor oil and quiet affection. She asked him once, sitting on an overturned crate while he explained the function of a carburetor, whether the story she had heard from her mother about some party and a fight was actually true, and Victor simply told her that sometimes people make assumptions about others, and sometimes those assumptions turn out to be wrong, and the best thing a person can do is keep being who they already are regardless of what anyone assumes. She seemed satisfied with that answer, in the way only children can be satisfied with answers that leave most of the story untold. And Victor was grateful, as always, that his daughter had no interest in turning him into anything other than her father. Several months later, fate, or perhaps something closer to deliberate coincidence on Vanessa's part, brought them into the same room one final time, at another charity event held in the same hotel where everything had started. Vanessa spotted him near the entrance, wearing the same charcoal suit, unconcerned as always with whether anyone in the room found him impressive, and instead of laughing or turning away, she walked toward him with something entirely different in her expression, something closer to humility than the confidence she usually carried into every room she entered. "This time I won't judge you by the suit," she said, a small smile breaking through despite the seriousness underneath her words, the kind of smile that came from someone who had genuinely changed rather than someone performing the appearance of change for an audience. Victor smiled back, the first real smile she had seen from him since the night they met, and told her simply that it sounded like she had finally learned the lesson that mattered most. They walked into the ballroom together that evening, not as a millionaire and a stranger she had once humiliated, not as a powerful woman and a man she had once dismissed as beneath her attention, but simply as two people who had somehow, through circumstances neither of them could have predicted, learned something essential about the value of genuine respect. Heads turned as they entered, the same kind of attention that had followed Vanessa into every room for years. But this time the whispers were different, curious rather than cruel, wondering at the quiet ease between two people who seemed to understand something the rest of the room had not yet learned. There was no dramatic announcement, no grand reconciliation speech delivered to an audience hungry for closure, only the simple sight of two people walking side by side through a crowd that had once laughed at one of them and worshipped the other, neither label mattering anymore in the space between them. Vanessa had spent years building a fortune by learning exactly what things were worth, the price of land, the value of a deal, the weight of a reputation in a competitive market, but it had taken one humiliating evening and a quiet man who refused to defend himself with anything other than calm dignity to teach her the one lesson money could never buy. Worth was never something you could read from a suit or a job title or the car someone drove into a parking lot, and the people most deserving of respect were often the ones too dignified to ever demand it for themselves. Victor never set out to teach anyone anything that night. He had simply wanted to attend a party as a favor to an old friend, drink a glass of water in a quiet corner, and go home to call his daughter before bedtime, the same modest ambitions he carried into nearly every day of his life. But sometimes the most powerful lessons arrive without anyone intending to deliver them, born instead from the simple act of a person refusing to shrink themselves just because a room full of strangers decided they should. Vanessa carried that lesson with her long after the gowns and galas faded into routine again, long after the gossip moved on to someone else's scandal. Because some lessons, once truly learned, do not fade the way headlines do. They settle quietly into the way a person treats every stranger they meet afterward, in every room, for the rest of their life, and that, in the end, mattered far more than anything either of them could have measured in dollars.